Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.
Well, Business in the Community Ireland has recently published its third annual Elevate Pledge report. The report provides a diversity profile of employees working within 60 signatory companies and serves as a snapshot of the levels of inclusion within the Irish workforce. Now, with the implementation of the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, diversity and inclusion will become even more important to organisations. Linda O'Sullivan is the Head of Social Inclusion with Business in the Community Ireland, and she joins us now to delve into the figures within the report and what the new directive requires. Linda, before we discuss this report in more detail, remind us about the work undertaken by Business in the Community Ireland.
So Business in the Community, Karl, is a not-for-profit organisation. We are a movement for economic, environmental and social change in Ireland, and we have a mission to bring about a low-carbon economy and inclusive societies where everybody has the opportunity to thrive. So essentially what we're doing is we're working with businesses on their responsible and sustainable business agenda.
And as I mentioned, the annual Elevate Pledge report has just been launched. But what is the objective of this pledge?
So Elevate is our inclusive workplace pledge. We've just launched the third annual report, and we started it back in 2021 because we could see that there was a growing focus on inclusion within business. So it was becoming much more of a strategic priority for businesses. And companies were looking to see, well, look, what can we do to really be proactive around inclusion? One of the things that we would have seen a lot was that, people would say, look, we're very inclusive. We don't mind where people come from if they have the right skills. Anybody can get a job in our company. But what we recognised was that actually that's not always the case. Sometimes there's barriers there, and certain groups of people with disabilities, for example, people from migrant communities, members of the traveller community, lone parents, experience a lot of disproportionate unemployment, I suppose. So what we set about with Elevate was building a pledge where companies could put their hand up and say, look, we want to be held accountable for any claims around inclusion. We really want to actively look at what we are doing in this space, and we want to ensure that any claims we have around inclusion, we can stand over.
How are the surveyed companies now performing in relation to gender representation?
So I suppose the gender story is very good in that our signatories, and we've 60 signatories currently signed up to Elevate, and they represent a collective workforce of over 150,000 employees. And so within that, we've looked at gender, and I suppose for us, gender is an easy one to start with because it's been on the agenda for business for decades now at this stage. So companies have been looking at gender representation. But I suppose what we were pleased to see in our report this year is that the Elevate signatories are continuing to outperform the national average as such when it comes to gender representation, female representation at senior levels. So we're looking at kind of an average of 40% female representation at senior management, at executive and C-suite. And when we compare that against CSO Gender Balance in Business Survey, that's sitting at about 30%. So you can see that companies that have really taken this, have focused on it, have started to build targets around female representation, are doing well.
While 40% is welcome news, what more could be done to improve female representation at management level within Irish companies?
Well, one of the things that we would look at, and again, we're seeing a good trend towards family-friendly policies within the workplace, and companies paying a lot more attention to these. And I suppose one of the things that we would be encouraging companies to do is look at those family-friendly policies, things like extended leave, flexible working, and that, and look at how they can encourage more men to take up those policies. Because I suppose in the past, women have tended to go for the flexible working or the shorter working weeks, and perhaps there's been an element of stigma around a man who decides to take on more parenting responsibilities. But that's changing, and so I think that's one of the very proactive things that companies can do to support female representation if they can I suppose balance out some of the parenting responsibilities across both women and men. And so, you see companies like Diageo and Aviva offering paid paternity leave on a par with maternity leave. for their employees. So practices like that, I think, are going to become more popular and hopefully will just add to that gender equity piece.
And talk to us about the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the requirements which it places on Irish businesses.
So the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive has arrived, and so companies are finding that they have to report in a more transparent way on a lot more issues regarding their business. It's essentially putting sustainability on a par with financial reporting, and particularly around the social reporting. Companies will have to rely on aspects of diversity within their own workplace and then within their value chain. So looking down at contractors and suppliers, and that one of the key pieces around that is looking at disability in the workforce. So employers are going to have to provide figures on the number of employees that they have with disabilities and the plans that they have in place in terms of being a welcoming employer and an accommodating employer for people with disabilities.
And what did the pledge report indicate about the inclusion of people with disabilities and people from ethnic minorities within the Irish workforce?
Across both, we're seeing an increase in reporting. So a greater number of companies are reporting on both disability and ethnicity. And then the disclosure rates, again, are higher. So what we saw from last year in terms of the disclosures, we had less than 1% of those that had disclosed actually having a disability. Whereas this year we're seeing that number is up at 6%, and we're seeing a lot more companies starting to really hone in on what they're doing and looking at widening their talent channels and being very proactively welcome of people with disabilities to apply. Again, a good example from within the signatory companies is SSE. So they specifically had measured the representation of people with disabilities and felt that they could be attracting more. And so we worked with them then to really up the outreach and to kind of make sure that applicants were coming through. And that they came through into standard recruitment practices, went through the normal recruitment channels. But because there were more people applying, that converted into a greater number of hires. In terms of ethnicity as well, we're seeing pretty good representation of ethnic minorities across the board for employers. There's a fairly good representation. Where you start to see maybe some challenges is at senior management levels. We're not seeing that breakthrough yet for ethnic minorities, still very much predominantly Irish, white Irish, holding the bulk of senior management positions.
And what one thing could businesses do to increase the number of people from ethnic minorities into management roles?
Well, I think it's to recognise where you have representation. So, for example, you might have a really good representation at entry-level roles, and so then the challenge is how come people are not then progressing into more senior roles within the company. So it's to look at that, and again, some practices that we've seen that can work really well is reverse mentoring or secondment into positions. So looking at opening up a kind of a placement or almost within the business and encouraging people from minority groups to go forward for positions, just to give them the experience of seeing a different role or something that maybe they hadn't thought of going for, and then working to develop people so that as and when opportunities arise, there's a good representation of people going for the role. And again, it's the best person gets the job, but the more people that feel confident to apply for a role, the more chance you have of increasing your diversity.
And of course, true inclusion often requires businesses to become involved in their communities in a collaborative way. So what type of community initiatives are you seeing amongst those companies that were surveyed?
There's two key things that we would see within the businesses that we looked at, and there are two areas that business and the community really works hard on as well. So in the first instance, partnerships with schools is really important, and in particular, deaf schools, because children going to DESH schools often don't have the same access to opportunity in terms of careers or employment as their peers in other schools. So if a business can come in and kind of open up that world of work for students, that's really beneficial, and it kind of sets the process then for children to start thinking about the types of careers that they can go for that maybe they wouldn't have thought of before. And so a huge number of companies, actually over 70% of the companies that we looked at, would be partnering with DESH schools, will be looking at access programs through local colleges, and would be, active in education in their local communities. And the other thing that companies can do, and we would really encourage them to do, is partner with employment support organisations. Now, again, Business and Community run a number of education programs and a number of employment programs, but there are programs all over the country as well, and in different areas of diversity. So, for example, if you want to increase the number of people with disabilities that are applying for you, to partner with an organisation that are working with job seekers with disabilities and so on, because those organisations really can understand the challenges that job seekers face. Many of them, including our own programs, offer in-work support, so can support people with the onboarding process and the integration into the workplace, which can often be a challenge.
Well, if you've just tuned in, that was Linda O'Sullivan, Head of Social Inclusion with Business in the Community Ireland, and it's great to see progress being made with regard to diversity and inclusion within the workplace.
Southeast Radio's Business Matters with Karl Fitzpatrick.